Welcome to the Autism Dad Podcast. I'm Rob Gorski. Thank you guys for taking the time to tune in. I really appreciate it. Did you guys know that telehealth is an effective alternative to waitlists for having your kids evaluated for autism? Dr. Taylor Day is back on the show again today, and she's here to talk about telehealth as it relates to evaluating kids for autism. This is her specialty, and it's something that she has been doing for a very long time. And in a world where there are 3-year-long wait lists for kids to see a doctor or specialist to be evaluated for autism, telehealth is a valid alternative. And I know that I had questions about it. I know that you guys probably have questions about it. And we're going to do that all today. So again, I'm glad you're here. We're going to learn something new today, and we're going to drop right into the interview. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here again. I appreciate it. When we were here the last time, we sort of started touching base a little bit on like the remote or virtual therapy and kind of like diagnostic process. And today we're going to focus on that and just help people understand how that works and maybe what the benefits are. But could you take a second and introduce yourself, remind people who you are, and then we'll just kind of dive in and see what we do.
Sounds good. And thanks so much for having me back. So I'm Dr. Taylor Day. I'm a licensed child psychologist, and I specialize in working with autistic children and their families, really focused on, providing, and we're going to talk more about this, but telehealth services, whether that's on the evaluation side, the therapy side, and really doing it from this like affirming lens and helping families better understand how their child's brain is wired and how to support them. And, I really got into this work too. And I think we touched on this in the last episode, but because I was raised with an autistic brother. And so, autism has been part of my world for quite a long time. And it's really shaped too the way that I have built my practice and how I serve families.
So just to build off of that real fast, like how has that lived experience impacted how you like do things with your practice? Is it being able to kind of relate better to people, or like how does that work?
I think there's a few ways. First and foremost, one of the things that I saw growing up, so my brother and I are 10 years apart. So I was 12 when he got diagnosed. And he was 23 months of age, but I saw my mom be the fiercest advocate and not take no for an answer. And so I think, one of the central tenets of my like practice and, how I really serve families is believing parents when they share things because they are the experts. And so I think watching my mom do that and realizing how much resistance she faced too, like she really had to push for the autism diagnosis in order to get my brother services. And I think that is one thing. I think another thing is there wasn't any support for my parents in this journey. It was like, okay, you have the diagnosis. He ended up doing like 40 hours of ABA in our home for 2 years straight. Plus we had other therapists in and out, but no one was really focused on like my parents and the process of, accepting and grieving the diagnosis and the shifts that come with that. And in turn too, if they're not supported, they didn't necessarily know how to support me. It's not their fault, but we just didn't have that like other family support. So that is really, really key in my practice. And then, I get people a lot that like hear my story and end up choosing my practice because of that. And some of it is like, you really get what this is like. Can you share your insight? Or I once went to a conference where I was speaking and I talked about the whole family approach and, supporting and like feeling emotions, but person after person kept coming up and were like, well, like, what was this like as a sibling? What can I do for, my other children in this? And so being able to speak and have that perspective as a clinician, but also that lived experience as a sibling, I think has been really beneficial.
Yeah, you just mentioned something that really kind of kind of got me emotional a little bit because all 3 of my kids are autistic. My 18-year-old was he was the last one diagnosed because he didn't present the way the others 2 did, right? So I had one who was non-speaking at the time, and I had one who had regressed and had all kinds of behavioral. So it was like really obvious on both ends, and he kind of slipped through the cracks. And even after he got diagnosed, uh, I he wasn't the squeaky wheel, right? And so much time and energy went into the higher needs siblings that even to this day he feels like he doesn't matter as much, which is not the case at all. But it's so hard to find that balance.
It is.
And, especially if you're doing this on your own and you're trying to manage whether you have a neurotypical uh, child mixed in with your neurodivergent kids or whatever, it's so hard to be everything for everyone and make sure that no one slips through the cracks.
Yeah.
And I don't see a lot of people focused on that. I guess I mean, parents, yes, but like providers, don't seem to always recognize the importance of, because like an autism diagnosis for a kid is a whole family. The whole family needs help. It's not just the kid. It's not just the parents. And I think a lot of times we forget that, and we have kids that suffer as a result.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I often talk about like the family ecosystem. Like you're living in an ecosystem, and what affects one person affects the other. And so an autism diagnosis doesn't just impact the child being diagnosed. There's a lot that has to be shifted as a result of that. And also, then simultaneously, you're talking about no one slipping through the cracks. And while also thinking about siblings is important, sometimes then I see parents prioritize their autistic children, their non-autistic children, or higher and lower support needs, whatever it may be, but then they're slipping through the cracks like themselves. And I know we've touched on this. I don't remember if it was the last episode you had me on here or when I had you on my podcast. I know we've talked about this, but even thinking about that ecosystem is like this idea of grief, right? Sometimes there's some resistance to this word, but it really is about grieving your expectations, what you thought would be, and learning to like realize your child is living in a world that isn't always the most affirming. And so there's some grief with that. But if you don't go through that process, what I think a lot of times we forget is how that parental emotion kind of pent up does end up really impacting the children too. And so it's not just this one directional path, it's really bi-directional, and it's really a web that we need to be working on each piece of this in order to create harmony within the ecosystem.
That is, I really like to hear that, because I just had like I don't I've been doing this long enough, 20 something years, 25 years now. And on the public side of things, it's about 17 ish. And I've learned to not I don't have like whatever you call like beefs with people online or whatever, because like it's just stupid. But there are some creators that have been promoting things, um, where it's shaming parents for going through that grieving process.
Mhm.
Because like if you're grieving, they associate it with grieving that their child is autistic, and maybe they are, maybe they're not. But it's much bigger than that. Like to me, that's very black and white and very like. And then if you are grieving after your child is diagnosed, it means that you don't love your child or you wish they were somebody else, or you have parents who have really high needs kids who are really struggling, who would want to remove the autism from their kids, right? And there's all this like stigma attached to all this, and I think it's so important that we be allowed to experience this very profound journey, however it is that we need to as humans, and just not get stuck in a bad place. And with what you're talking about, it's like it's not just giving someone a diagnosis, handing them some pamphlets with like OT and PT and shoving them out the door. You're recognizing the emotional side of this for the parents, helping them to get started on the right foot, because how they get started can impact the rest of their journey.
Right.
And there's that doesn't happen very often, like at all. That's I love that. I really do like that.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And yeah, I mean, it's been definitely a passion project. And like, again, thinking about some of my family's experiences does really shape how I show up as a clinician and how I built the practice, because now my practice is expanded beyond me as well, but how I'm training clinicians within my practice. Like, there are core values and core tenets that we have as part of the practice and how we execute things. And one of those is talking about these emotions. And so I think, when we hear that online, I even got a little hesitant for a while to talk about this idea of grief when I was learning about neurodiversity affirming practices. And that's something I've fully embodied. But what I realize is we also need to recognize that parents are humans in this and that they have their emotions. And so to teach them to shove their emotions down, let's talk about the ecosystem real quick. If we're teaching parents to shove their emotions down, these real vulnerable experiences that they're having, many autistic kids are really in tune with what's going on around them. And so they're watching their parents shove their emotions down. They're in turn learning to shove their emotions down as well, right? And like that to me isn't neurodiversity affirming practices. Like, we really should be validating everything that's going on and like helping them to process and having these self-advocacy skills and tools and communication and all of that. And emotions are part of all of that. And so this is, again, sometimes I think the simplified view would be like, let's just focus on the autistic child, but what is being modeled in the home, right? That has dramatic impact on the autistic child.
So just to touch on what you said, because I think it is really important, and it's something that I learned later on in my parenting journey. But like when I went through, I was married for 17 years, and when my ex-wife left, like I went through this whole grieving process because I
Yeah.
had never saw anything coming, and whatever. And I put on this face that everything was okay. Like I was totally fine. I was whatever. And, what I eventually what it led to was me having just a complete breakdown. My mom happened to be over and I just lost it.
Yep.
And my kids, who all along recognized that I was struggling. Now, I thought I was protecting them from like grown up emotions, you know, and I was actually causing them distress because every time they would ask me if I was okay, I would say, "Yeah, I'm fine." They knew that I wasn't, you know. They didn't maybe know what it was, but then they live very kind of symbiotically, right? So
Yeah.
like they don't have to know why I'm upset to experience that themselves, and they just sort of absorb it and then always find ways to blame themselves or be responsible for why I was struggling or whatever. But eventually what I learned was like I shouldn't have been hiding that. I should have been open with them about it and then modeled like how to deal with that. Like it's okay to grieve, it's okay to be sad, it's okay to be angry or whatever, but this is what I'm going to do to help me navigate this. And I now am at a point because of that like my youngest probably asks me 100 times a day if I'm okay. And I've had to promise him that going forward I'll be very honest with him about what I'm doing or how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
Um just because he already knows, like as much as I feel like I can hide it, he's not he's very sensitive to that kind of stuff. And if by not telling him, he feels like I'm lying to him, and it just creates all of this stuff. So like not cramming that stuff down and doing what you're talking about can model that healthier behavior and normalize emotions for our kids.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just such this fascinating process. And I think what's really cool, I just want to like reflect this conversation that we're having right now, this is the type of things too that I think services often don't address. And this is some of the reason too that tele like therapy or tele evaluations can work and be effective, because we still can have very real conversations like this. And that, again, because we're thinking about the ecosystem itself, it's not about just doing direct work with the autistic child, right? There's so much that can be done that can have so much impact. And I just think that, this is where I think as a whole in the autism field, we need to be thinking outside of the box, because we take a step back. Is everything we're doing right now working? No, it's not. I mean, we've seen a huge momentum shift in like therapy and how people view therapy and all of that. And I think some of what we need to come back to is the realness and rawness of this and the human emotions, and laying this as the foundation of anything that we're doing in order to support your autistic child.
And eliminate that guilt and shame and stigma attached to feeling those human emotions,
Yeah.
because that doesn't help anyone,
No.
and so I was like, I had a rough week last week because I was just seeing a lot of that, and so many parents get hurt by that. It makes them feel like they're failures or whatever. So I like the fact that you do that, because it is such a needed thing that shouldn't be that hard, and yet it just doesn't happen nearly enough.
Right.
You know.
I mean, I view one of my biggest roles is holding space for parents in this, whether it's holding space in the evaluation process to really understand their kid and like hear all the stories, right? Those stories tell me things about the child's behavior. A lot of times, parents in the evaluation process are telling me stories, and I can pull out symptoms to know, okay, they're describing this and this and this. But that's a powerful process, and holding space for it, I get to know their child and their family through this journey. And then on the therapeutic side, sometimes I literally have to remind myself my role is to hold space and that I can't fix everything as a clinician. And I think this is something as clinicians that we need to also shift away from, is feeling like we need to fix it all. Because the irony in this is, if we're coming and presenting with we need to fix it all, we're modeling to parents that they need to fix it all, then who by turn are modeling to their kids that they have to fix it all, right? And so
And then we just
it,
perpetuate that cycle.
exactly, exactly.
Wow. So, okay, so I was not exposed to telehealth until COVID.
Right.
That's when I experienced all of the amazingness that telehealth can be. And if ever I can do that, I am absolutely all about the telehealth side, because I don't have to go anywhere.
Yeah.
But like, for people who are maybe not familiar with it, or who are uncomfortable with it, like it's not the same thing, or like how does it work?
Yeah. I mean, just to point out, telehealth really did not gain momentum until the pandemic. And some of the reasons for that is really the true reality is insurance drives a lot of what services look like. And so insurance would not cover telehealth visits until the pandemic happened. It's a little interesting too, because right now insurance is starting to pull back on how much they'll cover telehealth visits. So that's making the landscape a little complicated. But the thing is, we realized how feasible it was. And so, I've been in the autism field in some capacity or another for like over a decade, doing evaluations, doing therapy. And I've been face to face with kids, and being able to take it to this telehealth model. What I realized is, one, I think there's a lot of misconceptions of like what can happen over telehealth or what it looks like. And also, I think we forget to reflect on the power of it. More often than not, your kid is in their safe space, in their home. They're getting to interact with you as a familiar individual, versus coming into this foreign place and directly interacting with me as a clinician. A lot of parents on the evaluation side in particular tell me that I get to see a better view of their child than they ever expected. They thought the child would mask, or they thought their child would be so anxious, or ironically, I do a lot of second time evaluations, like a second opinion. And a lot of these kids have gone into clinics, and like it's a short process, and parents don't ultimately get the autism diagnosis, and they're still feeling like their child's autistic. And they'll be like, wow, like you got more out of telehealth than someone did in person. And I think, one, it comes down to approach, but I also think we need to think about like, this is pretty naturalistic nowadays, right? Kids are used to seeing technology and connecting over technology. And so it's more a parent mindset shift, I find, a lot of times, than the kids struggling with it themselves.
Well, and then the kids are in a natural environment, as
Right.
opposed to um, trying to adjust to a strange place. in a room with a strange person
Yep.
where, I mean, you may need to have several sessions before they're even comfortable, like letting their guard down and just being who they are. And when they're able to do that from their living room where they have their toys, or maybe their favorite show is on, or they're on their iPad, like whatever it is, you can observe them in
Right.
their natural, like natural habitat. Right. And see what the parents are seeing, as opposed to like, yeah, because it's kind of like with my kids, when I would take them into their psychologist or psychiatrist specifically with issues or behaviors, they would never display that while we were there.
Right.
Right. It's like trying to get a car fixed, makes a funny noise until you take it to the mechanic. But if they can observe you in a natural environment, then that's really helpful a lot of
Yeah.
times.
It makes it more likely we actually see things. And I think the other thing is parents often have this misconception. I have this conversation. I'll do consult calls before, clients come into the practice. And I'll hear this a lot of like, ooh, I don't know if my kid's going to be able to do a telehealth session with you, whether again it's the evaluation side or therapy. And I'm like, I'm not expecting them to sit in front of a computer. Like, I've tested kids like legitimately. I had a 4-year old. We were doing an IQ assessment. And that's the thing. We have measures that are valid to do over telehealth now, thanks to the pandemic. I was doing an IQ assessment, and literally between every question, he was running around the room, right? So he'd zoom around the room, come back, I'd ask the next question, he'd answer it, he'd zoom around the room again. I've had kids that haven't been able to come on screen for 30 plus minutes, because they're really anxious about it. But that's okay. Like, I can engage with the parent, I can have them show me stuff off screen, that slowly warms them up to it. And the fascinating thing is this is part of the process, whether it's part of therapy or part of the evaluation. It's still helpful data, and it still can be therapeutic and supportive in the same way. And so I think some of it is shifting our expectations that an evaluation has to look a certain way or that therapy has to look a certain way. And when we can drop those expectations, we can more easily see the benefits of telehealth.
Yeah, so it's more about judging the end result rather than the process itself, I guess, if that
Yeah.
makes sense. Because everybody's used to um, being in person for a lot of this stuff.
Right.
And like we talked a little bit before we recorded, and we've talked quite a few times over the since I met you. And like there there are wait lists that are years and years
Right.
long just to get a diagnosis. Um, why aren't more people doing this?
I think people don't realize, I think for one, so psychology is really unique, although more fields are starting to go this way, but psychology in particular is unique because it has a compact. And this compact allows you, if you're licensed and living in one of the states that are part of the compact, you can get access to all the states. So myself and the psychologist in my practice, we practice in over 40 states. And so this is one of the things is it's hard. Like, directories aren't set up in this way for parents to be able to find us. But I think some of it is like, just it's different. We don't hear about it. I think sometimes the worry and the concern holds families back. And then I'll be candid with you. I think a lot of times, I explained a little bit of it where insurance is, and insurance really drives things. And so where we see a lot of these wait lists is through insurance. And so a lot of times insurance now isn't reimbursing to the same degree for these telehealth appointments. And so I'd say many of these telehealth practices, in my experience, are out of network with insurance, which means then you're paying for example, an evaluation up front. With my practice, you can get what's called a super bill and be reimbursed and potentially reimbursed by submitting it to your insurance after the fact, or we can take like HSA and FSA. But I know that's not feasible for all families too, from a financial perspective. And so I think, some of it is, I think our current healthcare system just really isn't set up in the most optimal way. And so,
No.
that'd be one way to reduce some of these wait lists is being able to see a clinician like anywhere in the country. I mean, that would help so, so much.
Yeah, I think, uh, oh, I just totally lost my train of thought. Telling you this Rob not medicated is really difficult to function as.
Uh,
um, I think that, I remember now. There's, because of the system that we live in, right? In order for insurance to cover things, we need a label. You need a diagnosis. But you can't get the diagnosis because insurance isn't covering the appointments needed to get the diagnosis, right? So, or there is a shortage of, because like I know in Ohio, there's a shortage of child psychologists, child psychiatrists, developmental neurologists, developmental pediatricians, all that stuff. And so you have a, a finite amount of resource that needs to be spread to an ever growing community, and we're not meeting that demand. And opening things up to telehealth, I think is so important to do.
yeah. And one thing too, I love being able as a clinician to think outside of the box. I like really believe like I never knew I had the entrepreneurial traits. Like I would have never guessed I would have been an entrepreneur, but I love being able to think outside of the box. And so like one of the services I ended up doing in order, to create some more accessibility was a group therapy model. And so this is all parents of autistic kids, and every family, it's a group call, but every family's getting their one-to-one time. What's really cool is you get to also learn from other parents asking questions and being coached and supported. And it allows us, rather than me having an hour in my schedule to see one family, we really can maximize that time, and it creates such an awesome community. But with that too, again, I have some flexibility not being in network with insurance. I don't actually require a diagnosis. So, like, if you're kind of waiting on wait lists, but you want this support, I'm trying to be like, how do we start supporting families now? Even if like that route is the only way, or, and I also am in the process of building out a membership where it's all educational information. What are some of those things you can start doing at home and start working on at home as you're sitting on these wait lists? And so I think this idea of this virtual world has really opened up so many resources. I mean, we even look at social media. Like, I get so many parents that are like, thank goodness for social media, thank goodness for podcasts. Like, I know so much information. And so, what I would also say is these telehealth services, these clinical services, and usually it's done like for me via Zoom, it's just another layer to this that allows us to be able to really support families and not be restricted by location.
So, when someone is going to you, say, for an autism diagnosis or an evaluation with their kids, does it take, I mean, aside from not having to wait forever on a list, how long does the process take? Is it usually more streamlined, or like, how does that
Yeah.
work?
I mean, yeah. So we keep pretty minimal wait lists, especially with 3 psychologists in the practice. We're able to get families in pretty quickly. And then from there, we schedule 3 appointments, and we schedule those right away. Usually they're about a week apart. The first one is a parent only appointment where we're gathering all the history, background information, that type of thing. The second appointment is directly with the child. The third appointment is a feedback session where we're going over, the results. But in between all of these sessions, we're having ongoing contact. We're collecting questionnaires. We're reaching out to people that you sign releases for, whether that's your child's teacher or a grandma or a babysitter. Like, we want to hear the people who know your child the best. But then you also have text access. You're able to send us videos of your child. That way we're getting more of this information and really gathering all of this. So, start to finish, we're looking typically about a month, and then we take a few weeks after that to write the report. But in that process of, while you're waiting for like the official documentation, because we pour a lot of time and energy into our reports, so it feels like this explanation of your child and not this like templated thing.
Mhm.
Then you can transition into this group therapy model that, with the evaluation, you get a month free. And then we're starting to break down the recommendations. Like, it was recommended this. Do you understand how to do that? What barriers are you facing? It might be go start the IEP process, and that parent's going, okay, in the feedback session, that sounds good, starts to do it, and is like, I have no clue what I'm doing. Well, that's something step by step in group therapy, then we're walking families through. So I would say start to finish, where, the whole experience, we're looking about 2 months, but you're going to gain a wealth of information. And not only, we can never guarantee a diagnosis, you're not paying for an autism diagnosis, but you're paying to better understand how your child's brain is wired, and then getting a tailored support plan for them moving forward.
Okay, which I think is amazing, and it just popped into my head. Like, um, I have had parents ask me in regards to like when my kids have experienced telehealth, do does the diagnosis carry the same weight as if it were done in person?
Great question. So, first and foremost, research came out during the pandemic because we had no choice but to do this. So, they decided to study it. And what they found is that telehealth evaluations, in terms of accuracy of diagnosis, are valid, they're reliable. They are just as accurate as in person. There are factors. And I think as a clinician, you need to understand where your limitations are, and be able to collect data and get creative and feel comfortable not being face to face with the child. But absolutely, like, you're still getting that same diagnosis. And I will say, to date, so I've been in practice a little over 2 years, like, I haven't seen pushback from, families being able to get, services as a result. I also, this is one thing, like, we genuinely care about families and their experience. If a family is getting pushback, like, I'm going to get on the phone and like figure it out for them. So, like, for example, I've had families that, do want ABA services, and they might have some loopholes. It's like, I've done care coordination with a pediatrician that's like in that state, knowing like exactly what needs to be done. We execute it, that type of thing. So I think the biggest block sometimes find is then getting insurance to approve ABA services if a family is going that route. But otherwise, it really has been a really seamless process. And, I gotten a few times, like I had one recently where they were like, well, this is a telehealth evaluation. I was like, hey, I'm happy to get on the phone with this school, personnel and talk about the process. And I will say that school, like, administration person backed right down. They're like, no, you're good. Like, I think some of it is like, it's an easy cop out. But then when they realize that a provider is truly invested in understanding this family, I think that changes the game too.
So then you could, so then you can work with. So let's say that they're diagnosed with autism and ADHD or whatever. You can then coordinate with like their primary care to like for like medication management and stuff like that, so that you guys can work together as a team, and it's
Yep.
not just a one-off thing. So I mean, it's the same type of care that you would get if you were going in person, only you're not having to wait 3 years to get diagnosed, which is so frustrating because like we drill into parents' heads that early intervention is so important, right? And then we make it impossible for them to get a diagnosis so that they can't get the early intervention. And so like what you're talking about, opening up that group to parents who don't even have the diagnosis yet, but are wanting to know what they can do while they're waiting, is really powerful and empowering.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. It gets access sooner, and I think too, it's fascinating. Like I talked about, I just want to point this out. I talk about being a neurodiversity affirming provider, but then I talk about families that are entering ABA. And so some of this is, there's so much nuance in the autism field, right? Like it's not
Mhm.
one or the other. So, and it's figuring out for a family. And like the really cool thing is, yeah, we do care coordination standardly. So I have literally called ABA centers before and been like, okay, tell me about your approach. Like, do you do X, Y, and Z? Are you willing to learn about neurodiversity? How much have you? And that ongoing collaboration. That's how we're going to change the field. Is not, in my opinion, is not completely writing things off. But parents, that's a lot to take on, right? And to know exactly what questions to ask. And so even if I'm not the one getting on the phone, I'm prepping them. Like I have a family right now who's needs to go back to psychiatry, and I'm like, I can make recommendations. I am not a prescribing provider, but I've seen, we get some training on it, and then we get enough experience of being like, here's the questions you need to ask. And like families are writing those down. So then they go into the appointment empowered, knowing what to ask, But then there's other times, yeah, I'll hop on a phone with a psychiatrist and just say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. Like it seems like some OCD symptoms. It feels like, we're not getting that balance out we'd expect with medication. And they're like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like, let me put them on X, Y, and Z. And so I think a collaborative approach is what's going to get
Hmm.
there, but also giving parents the information and tools. And again, I have this whole soapbox right now. I love social media. I think it's amazing, but it can't replace clinical care, right? And you have to make sure you're like working with someone who can help you understand that nuance. And that doesn't have to be me. That could be your child's speech therapist, for example, or their occupational therapist. But I think so often we hear these blanket statements on social media, and then it's hard to know what information to trust. And more importantly, it's hard to know what does and doesn't apply to your child. And so use the education, but then use someone at least temporarily to help you navigate this, especially if you're feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah, I think that's amazing because, like, I always talk about if I could be in charge for a day, how I would change the process for these things to happen. And you're essentially checking all of the boxes of
Aw,
all the things that I have like collected from parents in my own experience over the years about what it feels like to go through this process and not and to feel just abandoned sort of afterwards. I had someone on and they talked about it being like you get the diagnosis and you're shoved off a cliff and told to find a parachute on the way down, right?
yeah,
Like it is a daunting task, and if we can just better support parents right from the start, that helps them to be better versions of themselves, get off on the right foot, build their network, build their village, have access to other parents, which I think is really important to do, and ultimately are better able to parent their kids and then evolve and adjust and adapt and have the bandwidth and resources to manage the challenges that they may encounter along the way,
yeah,
and that just does not happen enough. And
right.
I love everything that you're doing. I think it's great.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's been such a joy to be able to develop the way that I want to, right? This is owning my own practice as I can do that and seeing where the gaps are. And yeah, I mean, one thing, the parachute example, like what I see pretty traditionally is parents get this report with all these recommendations, and it's like, do these million things. And then it's like, sometimes it's freeze mode, sometimes it's just like go mode. And I'm like, hold up, let's pause for a second. Just because a provider recommends it doesn't mean it's in the best interest of your child. It could be in the future. It might not be a now, but that's the thing. We don't have to do everything right now. And I mean, I think honestly, I think one of the biggest things that I see is many, many providers are standardly recommending ABA and a high number of hours of ABA. And but also on the other side, not providing the education of what to look for in providers and what the problematic practices have historically been with ABA. And then parents are like feeling like they need to do all of this, but in their guts, I hear this a lot. It's not sometimes even about the practice of ABA. Sometimes it's the number of hours of therapy. They feel guilty, like their kid is in therapy all the time. And it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, let's trust your gut here. I want to empower you as a parent to trust it. And I also want you to realize that quality is always going to matter over quantity of what you do. But these aren't messages that are told to parents. It's just a lot of times a recommendation list. And here's the thing, I don't even blame the providers. I blame our system as a whole that, really is not optimizing care for autistic children.
No, it's not. It's the system. The world is not designed for neurodivergent people to operate in. It's not very forgiving, and parents from the very beginning go into that panic mode because they're told all these things. They see all these deficits, right, that their kids have in the moment. And it's not ever explained to them that this is just like where we are today, right? We
Right.
need to document this so that we can measure progress as we go forward.
Yeah.
And this is not a predictor of where your kids are going to be for the rest of their life or what life is going to be like. This is just now, you
Right.
know,
Yeah.
and it really does impact that journey. I mean, I was told my youngest was never going to speak, so I assumed that he would never speak. My oldest, after he regressed and had all the health issues, we were told that I would probably, I mean, I would outlive him. He probably, may not make it out of his teens. He had a wish granted in 2017. I mean, that's just how like it was. And he is thriving now. My youngest started talking a few years after we were told he never would. He's in college full time as a junior in high school. I mean, like there's all of these things that we have no way of predicting
Right.
as we go forward. And so parents go into this despaired and hopeless and powerless, and you're empowering parents. And it's like, slow down, let's triage this stuff.
Literally.
Maybe ABA makes sense, maybe it doesn't. Not every kid needs ABA. I mean, it just doesn't,
Not
and
all not all ABA is designed equally either, right?
yeah.
Like, I know some amazing, amazing providers who are like trying to change the field from the inside out, right? And like, yeah, so there's so many factors, but it is a triage approach. And I also think that, you know, I like totally lost my train of thought now.
Sorry, I was
That
choking on my water.
yeah, are you okay?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay.
Thank you.
But yeah, it is a triage approach. And I think also the thing to like remember in all of this is we could do better as providers at helping parents to realize this too is yes, in order to get an autism diagnosis, it is a list of deficits based on the DSM-5. That is how we diagnose autism. It comes from the medical model. But that doesn't mean, number one, that strengths don't simultaneously exist with it. They do, right? And we need to be seeing what those are right now. I think that is so important. And I see a lot of times we don't help parents understand that. We also don't help parents understand this idea of presuming competence, which is what you were talking about with your kids,
Mhm.
let's actually believe what is possible and help to support that and help, still give them the tools and the accommodations and, teaching skills and all of that, but presuming that they are capable. And then also, I think this is a really important message that when you first get that diagnosis, like you can have hope and that can simultaneously exist with difficult things. They're not
Mhm.
mutually exclusive. And I think so often the brain likes to focus on one thing or the other. Like it's very black and white in how it thinks. But it's like those things can simultaneously exist. And it is okay, just like we were talking about earlier, to have the emotions. And I never said this, but like we have to go through that emotional process and that grief process to get to the place of acceptance. Acceptance doesn't just spring up on you. That can go occur with believing your child is capable, believing your child will grow and progress, believing your child, has all the capabilities that inside of their brain. And we just have to figure out how to connect and support them, in the way that they communicate and they navigate the world.
I completely agree, and I'll just add before we kind of close things out is like my youngest last year, actually about a year ago now, um, he and I we were goofing around and practicing mock interviews because he was going to co-host some stuff with me, and I just was asking him, I'm like, you were nonverbal, you didn't speak until you were like 4.5 years old. I was like, do you remember not being able to talk? And I'd never asked him that question before because I never the concept of presuming competence just I hadn't been a thing. Like I never thought he
Well, it
was
wasn't back
dumb.
then.
Like I knew he was very capable, but he remembers everything from being able from when he was unable to speak. He remembers hearing the words in his head. He remembers the frustration of people ignoring him, feeling like nobody cared because they didn't hear him talking. Like, and so when he finally did start talking, it was like conversational speech because he had the words all along. There was just a block somewhere, right? There was just a connection that hadn't fired off. And that experience has really, really reinforced with me the need to always presume competence. Just because he communicated in a different way doesn't mean that he's not in there and that he
Yeah.
doesn't have all those thoughts and feelings and emotions and needs and wants and ideas and whatever. So we always need to presume competence. Always.
It was so cool. Just real quick, a story. This morning I was scrolling on Instagram and Meaningful Speech and Siblings on the Spectrum did a collab. And Jessie is someone I've connected with and I just absolutely love her. But she was showing, they were doing an eye exam with an AAC device of like, okay, what letter do you see? And her son was able to go and press like, and actually read the chart. He'd never been able to access that before. And it's so easy to assume because he doesn't speak that, oh, well, he must not be able to read the letters on the wall. And it's like, no, we just have to shift our perspective and the way we think about this and realize like so much more is feasible and they're capable of so much more. And yeah, so I think these stories together, like I hope, and I guess just to connect this back to with the evaluation process, this is why understanding your child is autistic is so important, because then you can begin to build the path of how to support them and, understanding how their brain is wired and how they interact with the world. And an evaluation tells us exactly that. And I just think, it's all part of this process and journey that's so incredibly important. And I hope it also gives families hope to know, like it can keep evolving from here and things will keep changing. And I'll just tell you real quick, Rob, so group therapy, we have calls, but then we have a chat where families have unlimited access to me. And one of the families shared one of your reels basically of you saying like, it's hard
Oh,
right now. I remember when it's hard, but guess what? It does change. And like the conversation that got brought up as in regard to that reel was so important. And I think these are conversations we just need to be having more often. So thank you for creating that because it had a lot of impact on the families I'm working with.
oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Yeah, I just for me it's about trying to make something positive come from all the things that I have been through and having conversations and sharing things that nobody ever shared with me that I could have benefited from, and I think a lot of times there's too much stigma and shame attached to a lot of these things. And, opening up and being honest about things it's so relatable to so many people because a lot of people are feeling and thinking the same thing, but they didn't realize it's okay, and that they're not alone. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Um, how can people find you?
Yeah. So if families are curious about learning about my clinical services, where I practice, and where the psychologists in my practice, you can go to drtaylorday.com. It's just DR and then taylorday.com. And then I love being able to provide, free education. I do podcasts like this. I have my own podcast, Evolve with Dr. Tay. And then I'm on Instagram all the time. It's just the.dr. Tay.
Awesome. I'll have all that stuff in the show notes so people can connect and find you. And then just lastly, I'll be remiss if I don't ask you this question. My girlfriend and her daughter are absolute hardcore Swifties, and I know
Yeah,
that you went to the Eras tour, right?
did. I actually
What
went
was that?
twice.
Oh my god,
Yeah.
I'm jealous because they've got me hooked. Are you? What was that like? Was it amazing? Is it as amazing as it seems like it would
Oh,
be?
it is so surreal. Like it is, yeah. So actually, this second time my boyfriend went with me, and even he was like, that was the coolest production I have ever seen. Like, and it's so cool and so empowering. And there's so much positivity there. And I feel like there's things, you go there and you're in this world where yes, hard can coexist, right? And that we can be present and we can enjoy something together, it's truly infectious. And it was an incredible experience.
That's amazing. I'm jealous, actually. But I appreciate that. You have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you again for everything that you do. And, we'll connect all of your information so people can find you and you can help more people out. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
Anytime. Real quick before I let you go, I just wanted to say thank you for tuning in today. I really appreciate it. I'll have all the information for this week's episode in the show notes below so that you guys can just click and learn more about my guest or sponsors. And you can also find me at theautismdad.com, where you'll have all of my links where you can contact me if you're interested in being a guest on a show or sponsoring an episode or just want to provide feedback or even show ideas. I love hearing from you guys, so feel free to do that. You guys have a great rest of your day, and I will talk to you next week. See ya.